Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 302nd episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And welcome to the show and welcome to nearly April. So I want to just go back a little bit and let you know that in February, I went to see a comedy show entitled You Are All Resources, a work in progress by the comedian Emma Davies. The comedy explored HR, the workplace, and the quest to feel valued at work. Hosted by morally grubby, as she calls herself, as her character Alison Pope, expect questionable professional advice, power dressing, and light audience participation. Emma Davies was the runner-up in the West End Women's New Comedian of the Year 2025. And this was a kind of quiz participation show and dark comedy about HR and the ways in which it can be deeply dysfunctional in any organization. So recently I've been seeing and feeling like traditional workplaces have become very much akin to the Wild West. What do I mean by this? I mean, redundancies out of nowhere, policies not being followed, people leaving jobs at a very high rate, poor management, increased bullying, reduced professionalism in the workplace. And this can be described as toxic workplace culture. And I've got two really helpful definitions, I think, here that I'd like to share with you, because it's very easy to throw this word toxic around, but how can we actually define it clearly when we are talking about this subject? So according to Monaco's solicitors, who are not based in Monaco, they're based here. They have a really great definition, and I've put the link in the show notes for you. And they describe a toxic workplace as an environment that has an unpleasant and hostile atmosphere that makes it difficult to work in. In practice, it can mean such acts as you and your other employees getting cold-shouldered, undermined, or ostracized by colleagues, or even worse, subjected to bullying or harassment and various other forms of discrimination. Now, I would actually argue that cold-shouldering, undermining, and being ostracized by colleagues is a form of bullying. Maybe it's classified as covert rather than overt bullying, but for me, it's definitely bullying. They go on to say that working in a toxic workplace can adversely affect your ability to perform well and also your mental health, and it can have repercussions extending into your personal life. And then I came across a really great blog piece, which is from miphealth.org.uk, Tips to How to Survive a Toxic Workplace by leadership coach Siobhan O'Reilly. And she defines a toxic work environment as untrustworthy leaders, non-inclusivity, gradism, favoritism, poor leadership, and a lack of empathy and respect. Staff working in toxic workplaces typically describe experiences such as a lack of collaboration, keeping their heads down, normalized poor behavior, feeling bullied and harassed, and a climate of fear. And I thought this was very, very well expressed. So I wanted to add that one in. Now, we have got an interesting situation going on in workplaces at the moment. So return to the office is still going on. Many people have moved to different parts of the country during 2020, 2021, 2022. I know that there's an organization I work with that have said people have to be in the office 2 days a week. Some departments enforce it, some don't. And so there's kind of rancor between senior leaders saying, well, you don't enforce it and my staff are annoyed. And other staff saying, well, I really love it and it's great. And actually, why should I enforce my team to have to do this, especially when I've got a young workforce who can barely afford the commute in? So that's an interesting one. We've got AI integration rapidly influencing the nature of work. I don't think we've had a thorough enough conversation about that. And I'm not against it. And I was having a chat with a friend yesterday about AI in social work, and there's a specific tool for social work, but how is that data being saved? Where is it being saved? And who owns that AI? I think it is a really important, especially for areas like social work where there's very deep personal details about people. We've got generational shifts, which we talk about on this podcast. So you've got, Gen Z, that's almost a COVID generation that have grown up in this digital world. And again, we were talking about yesterday, younger staff needing training on how to use a phone. They'd never seen a phone with punch dial buttons. And we were laughing and saying, remember when there were the rotary phones where you had to move the dial around, actually take your finger and push the dial down. So yes, and then of course, we have silent generation potentially in some organizations, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, geriatric millennials like me or younger millennials and Gen Z. Now, that's not to say that people fit neatly into boxes, because another friend said to me, oh, we had this terrible training at my school. And this person, it was almost like he was reading horoscopes. Now, that's not helpful to do. And of course, we have to look at the individual in front of us. But of course, we can't also avoid the fact that every generation has grown up in a political time and place. So that is going to influence their lens, the opportunities they had, they didn't have, the way life is, life was, access to technology, and all of that is going to play a part then into how people do their jobs. I think that's the more important bit. There's been a notable trend and increase in second jobs. So people having to take on second jobs due to financial pressures. I've been really sad hearing from friends and colleagues that people in their team do 5 days a week and then go to work in a pub or a cafe at the weekend. And these are 20-year-olds, and that must be incredibly stressful. I think there's also, putting megalomaniacs on pedestals. So do check out episode 300, my book review of Careless People by Sarah Wynne Williams. And the person I called a coddled prince after listening to that book who is Mark Zuckerberg. So, megalomaniacs and how they're pampered. And I've seen it myself in higher education environments. We've got excessive workloads and staff shortages, particularly in statutory sector. I mentioned social work, NHS, teachers, anything statutory healthcare, charities, which is third sector, slightly different, but it's so people are not able to handle, and why should they? They are impossible workloads. Colleagues leaving and not being replaced. Of course, we have cost of living crisis, which is only getting worse with the wars that are waging, fear and insecurity, economic uncertainty. Then that leads to restructuring, fears around redundancy. This is affecting currently 17% of workers, and there's a big climate of insecurity. And there's poor management and support. It's interesting, in 2017, when I started my business, there was a lot, people could have 1 or 2 days out to do proper mental health training to really upskill managers. Now, I'm lucky if people will give me an hour or two, because everyone wants the information in a very short span of time. And information is a very interesting one for me as well, because I often sit here and wonder, with all this information out there, why are people struggling so much? And then a few weeks ago, on a writing course that I took part in, the tutor had shared a video from one of my favorite writers, Elif Shafak. So she's a Turkish writer, and she was talking about the difference between information and knowledge. And then the penny dropped for me, because I thought, yes, there is tons and tons of information. We can read something, but that doesn't mean we can absorb a deep tacit knowledge from one piece of information. So if people want training in half an hour or 20 minutes, you can have the words. You're not going to have really the whole information, the full picture, and then the tacit deep knowledge that comes from learning and discussing for a longer period of time, trying things out in a training environment. So many staff, as a result, feel unable to talk to their managers or their leaders or people that should be looking after them about stress. And 19% of workers report that their employer has no measures in place to handle stress or mental ill health, which, given the conversations we've been having in this country over the last 10 years, that does make me very, very sad. In 2024-25, let's bring in some statistics. It's thought that around circa 22.1 million working days were lost in the UK due to work-related mental ill health, such as stress, depression, or anxiety, making it a leading cause of long-term sickness absence. Mental ill health constitutes around 47% of long-term absences, with work-related stress, depression, or anxiety accounting for 50% of all work-related ill health cases. So that is from the Office of National Statistics. So this is just getting worse and worse and worse. It used to be 16.5 million working days, and then it just goes up and up and up and up and up. So given all of this, and given that there are lots of challenges, and I don't think any single HR leader can solve them, even with a big team, but what are the systemic and personal reasons maybe that HR leaders stay silent in toxic environments? So we're thinking about the senior leaders. So, of course, there's going to be, like there is with anyone, fear of retaliation. It is hard to speak out. I don't think it's easy at all, particularly if you haven't ever spoken out before. So you're going to compromise your job security, your career progression, and personal risk. There is the whole thing about loyalty to the organization. And I wish this weren't the case. But of course, the longer that people stay in an organization, the more loyal they are likely to feel towards it. And there is a pressure to protect a company, an organization, a reputation. It might be around around profits. Again, in corporate sector, I think there's a different element because, of course, you get there will be bonuses involved. I think in statutory sector and third sector, it is different. Power dynamics, normally at HR, yes, they might senior HR leaders and directors. Yes, of course, they do have a table at the C-suite, but often I have seen they feel, or there is limited authority in the face of toxic leadership or cultural norms, or potentially that it's easier to buy into that than to speak out. And people haven't been given the tools for that. And I do find often that HR culture is one that doesn't challenge authority. It's been inculcated in that way. And also essentially that how if we're slowly and gradually exposed to toxic behavior over time, it can normalize unethical behavior, which is kind of what we're seeing with things in social media and the press and desensitization. So I really hope you're enjoying the content of my podcast and you want to keep up to date. If you are, then why not join my newsletter? Don't forget, when you join my newsletter, you can choose the download. So just go to diverseminds.co.uk/download and choose the resource that works best for you. And also just a reminder that the podcast is now fortnightly, but if you're missing weekly content, you have 5 years worth of weekly episodes, and the 6th year is the fortnightly episodes to listen to and catch up on. And if you want my handy guide that lists the episodes with a clickable link, you can also get it at the downloads link I shared with you. So given that many HR leaders stay silent when things get toxic, what is the remedy? What can be changed and what can be done differently? And it is about implementing a combination of preventative, investigative and cultural measures that align not only with UK employment law, particularly the Equality Act 2010 and the new Workers' Bill that's going to be coming through, and good practice. We don't have to wait for good law to come in to initiate things. But I also think the first part is realization that things aren't working and that perhaps there is a culture of accepting poor behavior and sidling up to senior leaders to make our lives easier. So let's think about this idea of the investigative, I would also say proactive measures. So the first thing I would say is about reading policies and redefining what constitutes toxic behavior. So reading the policies, making sure they're fit for purpose, having a conversation about this word toxic is thrown around a lot. Certain words get bandied around like toxic, boundaries, but what do they actually mean? So what does this mean? What will we not tolerate? What will we not accept? What will we actively fight against? And create explicit codes of conduct that are consistently enforced. So I also think it's crucial to remember that senior leaders, the C-suite, senior leadership, whatever the title they have, they are not God. They are not a higher being. They are mere mortals like the rest of us. And we live in a time of the cult of personality and the cult of celebrity and the cult of influencers. Now, of course, I'm not saying senior leaders of many organizations, of course, they don't have glossy Instagram profiles. I'm not comparing them to that, but there is a reputation in an organization. So as individuals, we can't change their behavior, but can we pull together and challenge this poor behavior? Because I think that's so important. And maybe part of that is, if you don't already have it, is to implement anonymous reporting. So you might have heard of report and support as one model. There's several different models or packages that you can buy that provide safe, confidential and anonymous channels for reporting and give you data about hotspot mapping, which parts of an organization keep flashing up. So 62% of people are more likely to report issues if it's anonymous. And also, how can we do that in staff surveys when people feel confident that they can declare that they have experienced or witnessed bullying and harassment behaviors? Because often people say, well, actually, if you drill down, you could probably identify that it's me, because we have to give so much information, our grade, the area that we work in, our ethnicity, our age, our gender. You could probably work out it was me. So there's a way that needs to be done for people to feel confident. I think as well, investigate thoroughly. Now, investigations can often be botched jobs. They can be done really, really badly. I think it's essential, and I don't see this very often, that people are trained. And actually, if you need to hire an outside group of people that don't know, that are trained and know what they're doing, but they don't know the organization, they don't know the characters, they don't know the power that's at play, I think that can be incredibly, incredibly helpful. I also feel that this enforcement of zero tolerance, it's very easy to say we have a zero tolerance policy. Again, like the word toxic, what does it actually mean? I was sharing an example with some colleagues yesterday in a delivery session. There was a suicide of an academic. And as he had planned his suicide, he had written an email to go out after his death. And in this email, he named a particular person who had bullied him and pushed him to take his own life through unrealistic and unrelenting work pressures in the medical academic field. And this person had a very close colleague in another London institution. And that colleague was very vociferous and very supportive, and actually did even go to the coroner's inquest around the death, and made a case for his friend and said, yes, it's a suicide, but actually we need to look at it maybe as corporate manslaughter, and these are the reasons why. Anyway, some months later, this individual that was named as having harassed and bullied this individual who had taken his own life was then given a promotion. And so but yet I know this organization would absolutely say they have a zero tolerance policy, but it's not the case. And the problem is that if people bring in money, if they are good at collaborating, if they are big hitters in some way, that they are exempt. And we see this all the time. We've seen it with Harvey Weinstein. We've seen it with, the Epstein files, which, so we see all this. Now, that's not necessarily a workplace, but many of the perpetrators of heinous crimes are working in very significant and substantial workplaces, and nothing was done, and nothing has still been done in most countries. So enforcing zero tolerance is important and is essential. Sorry, important is a very weak word, I think, in this context. And it links to reading your policies, realizing that people are not God, realizing that they are human and need to be held accountable. Okay, then the thing around proactive is about training managers, and particularly in how to have conversations, emotional intelligence, supporting staff, not to be counselors, not to solve everything, because that is also not what we want, but how to identify what we are defining as toxic behaviors, handle conflict, promoting psychological safety. And don't forget episode 245, all about what is psychological safety at work. And then I would say we need some radical HR. And as I was looking at this, I found an organization that I strongly recommend you look at called RadHR, altogether.org. And they have some great ideas, and you can actually feed into it. It's a very collaborative space. And they talk about restorative grievances. So moving from punitive top-down disciplinary actions when things have often gone too far, to mini investigations that include buddy systems and wellbeing support for employees involved in disputes. I would also add to that at the first fizzle or issue, then to support people in having mediation, because if people are entrenched in their positions and it goes on for too long, that's when mediation is less likely to work. I've also seen it most times used as a last ditch attempt rather than a first proactive attempt to solve any issues. So I think this is really important. They talk about radical transparency, so sharing financial data and decision-making power directly with staff, which I think is brilliant. And if we're thinking about psychological safety, that would really help. Alternative care policies, so moving beyond minimum sick leave to offer tailored care leave for employees looking after themselves or others. And I think that would be absolutely brilliant. I think that really helps with preventing a toxic environment. It really normalizes care. It normalizes having to look after other people and ourselves. Specifically talking about care, but I really feel very strongly that disabled employees should get a minimum of 5 days that does not count towards sick leave, that does not count towards anything, that they can use to manage their disability. I think that's really, really important. And also they talk about, RadHR talk about self-managed workplaces. So using care teams to monitor the overall health of the collective rather than leaving employee management solely to a line manager. Now, of course, a line manager has a duty, but they're talking about this more community, this more check-in, this more shared care and responsibility for employees. And so everyone can learn these skills. And if you don't get on with your line manager, or you don't feel like you want to talk to your line manager about specific things, there are other people in an organization. And actually the organization Happy talks about people choosing their line managers as well. So do check out that website. There is such good information there. And I think that when things get toxic or get hard, it's very easy to shut down and think, I'm going to ignore this and things are going to go away, but that doesn't happen. If you want to know more about bullying and what to do about it, do check out episode 63 with Chloe Go. And she did research about anti-bullying initiatives that work. That is a brilliant episode, evidence-based. She's gone on to do some brilliant things. Episode 267, how to handle gatekeepers. So what are gatekeepers, how to handle them, the kind of proactive side, not the necessarily seen as the overt bullying. Speaking out about workplace bullying, which is a blog and a link to a podcast I did with Petra Veltsaboa. And finally, bullying and harassment in the workplace, what you can do about it. And that's episode 11. So I really hope you have found this episode useful. HR can, of course, be, they're big functions. They do a lot of things. HR leaders should be role modeling and setting example. But sadly, in many instances, we have seen HR leaders hinder positive practice. We are in a very strange and precarious place right now in the workplace. There are challenges that need to be acknowledged prior to starting this transformative work. There is a remedial, preventative, proactive approaches that are required. The same way of doing things over and over again isn't working, so we need a change. We need a radical change. So I really hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget, I run workshops, training sessions and keynotes for organizations all about creating positive, happy and equal workplaces. So please get in touch with me to find out more at Leyla, Leyla at diversminds.co.uk. And I really hope you've enjoyed today's show and the shows over the last 6 years. So if you have, why not leave me a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast from. And don't forget, if you want to know more about my work, you can also catch my TEDx talk, something you can watch in your break as it's just 12 minutes long. And that link is bit.ly/TEDx Wolves, WOLVESLO. And I hope you enjoy it. And if you do, please leave me a positive comment on YouTube, share and like. Also, don't forget to connect with me on LinkedIn, on Facebook at Diverse Minds UK. And do join me in 2 weeks' time, where I'll be giving more insights on mental health, inclusion and positive workplace practice.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.